Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. Before I introduce our next episode of the Authority File, I want to remind our listeners that we have a brand new podcast out. It's called Patron Driven, and it's a narrative-style podcast that brings you crowdsourced library stories where the personal meets the professional. Our first story is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey, and the 2 years it took to rebuild. Patron Driven is out now, wherever you get your podcasts. In this episode, however, we're going to be talking about the future of vocational education. My guest is Dr. Rupert Maclean, an internationally renowned researcher, author, and consultant on technical and vocational education and training. Dr. Maclean, based in Australia, currently divides his time between Melbourne, where he is an adjunct professor in the School of Education at RMIT University, and Hobart in Tasmania, where he runs at the Education Innovation for Development Consultancy. He's been a chair professor of international education at the Hong Kong Institute of Education and a director at UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, among many other higher education and international agency positions. Dr. Maclean has also produced an incredible volume of research on education, including education for the changing world of work with a special focus on technical and vocational education. He has developed 2 international handbooks, the 6-volume Handbook of Education for the Changing World of Work and the Handbook of Technical and Vocational Education and Training and Research. He's the editor or co-editor of 3 international book series, all of which have been published by Springer Nature, the sponsor of this episode. In this 4-episode series, Dr. Maclean and I talk about some of the defining moments of his tenure at UNESCO, the impacts on the world of work due to the shift from manufacturing to the information age, global trends in technical and vocational education, and why countries must provide equitable access to education. In this 2nd episode of our series, Dr. Maclean discusses how the role of teachers and teacher education are evolving to accommodate new vocational trends and the growing trend of businesses collaborating with higher education, particularly vocational training programs and research. Okay, so let's move on to the subject of much of your research. How has the shift from manufacturing or industrial production to the information age impacted vocational education, the job market, and so on?
Well, it's really had a profound effect, a really, really big effect, particularly the 4th Industrial Revolution, which we are in now, which stresses the importance of technology, artificial intelligence, the internet, and so on. This is really changing dramatically the nature of work and the types of occupations that are now required to enable our societies to function effectively. And because it's changing the world of work and it's the nature of work, the types of jobs that are required and so on, it also requires us to modify education and schooling because, schools don't exist in isolation to the society that they are located in. Schools are there to meet the needs of the society and to meet the needs of the individuals living in that society. So as societies change and economies change, so you have to modify education and schooling. You've got to change the curriculum. You've got to change the sort of preparation that's required for employment, but also not just skills for work, but skills for life. So this has really had a big impact. So we're much more concerned now with education than training. We have to engage in lifelong learning. We have to enable individuals to be self-starters when it comes to their learning, to be able to learn in an unsupervised way, to be able to update their knowledge and skills as the requirements occur. A lot of the education that occurs is now occurring on the job. Companies are providing perhaps more than they ever have in the past in-job and on-job education and training. So it's had a profound effect. And in addition to the content of education, of course, the technologies are affecting the way in which we deliver schooling. The increasing use of the internet, computers. This has been really brought home, I think, very clearly. We've had this recent problem with the COVID-19 pandemic. And as you know, many people have now been not allowed to go to school. They've had to go into social distancing and study from home with the assistance of their parents and things like that. The internet's
Right.
been absolutely crucial, hasn't it, in enabling
Yes.
them to do that.
Right.
Um,
And in fact, it's one of those areas that I think a lot of folks are COVID-19 is acting as sort of an accelerant, I would think, of some of these ideas that have been percolating in the background for a long time now in terms of
yeah.
distance education and sort
hmm
of the increased use of technology in education.
hmm
Um,
Well, COVID-19 has really disrupted societies, hasn't
mhm.
it?
Yeah.
It's resulted in people having to rethink taken for granted assumptions about social life, about education, about schooling, about the way in which societies function, about the responsibility that individuals have towards each other, towards the group, not just pure individualism and concern with self and things of that type. So it's really encouraged a very fundamental rethinking about social life and about economic life.
Right. When you mention lifelong education, what does that look like in practice? Is that something where an individual obviously would go through a traditional education up to a point, and does industry take over after that as they become employed, and their employer is responsible for their training and education beyond that? How does that work?
Well, in years gone by, the sort of schooling you had or education you had at secondary school, primary
Hmm.
school, university was seen as a way of equipping you for life. And if you were educated or trained in a particular occupation, the expectation was that that would basically prepare you for that occupation for your whole working life. But now,
Right.
because of the great areas of change and disruption and so on, it's no longer the case. You have to
Hmm.
keep upgrading your knowledge and your skills. You can do that um, through attending courses. You can do it because your employer organizes training and education sessions on the job, in service, on service, and so on. But also, people have to take more responsibility for their own education to learn the skills to actually to be able to upgrade their skills by using the internet through other means like that as well. And therefore, that really has changed the nature of education and schooling. So, this notion of lifelong learning is that we have to learn over the full span of our lives. We can be assisted with this, but we must take also personal responsibility. If we don't engage in lifelong learning, we're going to be left behind. We're not going to
Hmm.
have the repertoire of skills required to continue in gainful employment. So, this is really a major rethinking of education and schooling and what that should consist of and involve.
Right. So here in the U.S., higher education is morphing in some ways into a vocationally driven model that emphasizes the preparation of students for specific job markets. I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of, more globally, what patterns or trends in technical and vocational education are, and like how are other regional educational models evolving in that respect?
Well, more traditionally, education was there, wasn't it, to give people the knowledge and skills to function in society. They had to develop literacy and numeracy and learn the history of their country and the history of world countries, learn the cultural characteristics of their society, and so on. Now, partly because education is so expensive and much of education is paid for by society, there's a feeling that we have to also look at the economic contribution of education and schooling and therefore preparing people for employment. So the
Hmm.
view that education can be just academic and so on, personal development, personal fulfillment, and that education simply has a value in its own right in that sense, that's now being questioned, and it's now being said, well, education is costing so much, costing society so much, taxpayer money, for example, takes a lot of investment. Therefore, we have to look at the payback to society and the payoff to society. And that's why there is this trend, international trend on the vocationalisation of education, looking at how what we learn actually also prepares us for gainful employment, enables
Right.
us to have the knowledge and skills to undertake the sort of work requirements within our particular society. But we have to be careful, because if we move too far in that direction, we might forget that education isn't just concerned with preparing people for work, it's concerned with preparing them for life, because
Mm-hmm.
individuals are also, they're voters, okay? They're members of civil society. They are people who need to contribute in a comprehensive way to the betterment of their society, not just through the labour force, but through other means as well. And therefore, we have to get the balance right between skills development for employability and skills development for life. And that's a continuing dialogue, what that balance should be. Um, how do we work that out? This is one of the things that organisations like UNESCO do by
Mm-hmm.
encouraging a dialogue with countries, countries sharing experience and things of that type, to actually try and get that balance right.
Okay. So I'm curious. You've done a lot of work too with on sort of the teacher education aspect of all of this, and I'm very curious to hear about how the role of teachers and teacher education has been evolving to accommodate these new trends that you've just been describing.
Well, one of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic has done is reminded people across our societies just how important teachers are. Suddenly parents have been in the situation where they have to homeschool their children, and they realize how demanding that is, because it isn't just learning basic skills. It's also learning how to think, how to reason, and things of that type. So I think there's a greater appreciation now, broadly, of just how important teachers are. Um, with teachers, we moved from a time, many decades ago, when we spoke about teacher training, which was equipping teachers with the skills to train their students in mathematics and science and so on. Increasingly, we are aware of the importance of values and ethics, and how teachers have to also be role models for their students. So we talk increasingly of teacher education rather than teacher training, to
Mm-hmm.
try and bring into play the holistic aspect of education, and the fact that teachers have such an important role to play when it comes to introducing people to their society, not just labour force requirements, but into their culture and so on. And also, teachers are now increasingly helping people to learn how to learn, to be self initiating learners, for example,
Right.
and things of that type. So I think that um, we need to look, particularly after the COVID-19 crisis, at other groups in society who make an enormous contribution. I mean, the medical profession, the nurses, the social workers who are helping people cope with mental health issues during the COVID-19 crisis, and really look at um, what skills they require and how to attract the best people in society into teaching, and
Mm-hmm.
to give them the necessary education, and give them a reward structure which actually motivates them and rewards them for the very important contribution to society and the economy.
Okay. So businesses are seeing an opportunity here to partner with academic institutions, particularly in vocational training programs and research. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the ethical concerns inherent in that relationship and how they may be being addressed. How are educational institutions navigating that relationship?
Well, it's a very important relationship, but it
Hmm.
does require some careful navigation. What we have to increasingly do, and we are increasingly doing this, is making sure that when it comes to looking at the curriculum within education, whether it's at primary, secondary, or tertiary levels, that we don't just have educators deciding upon that, that we have a genuine partnership between business, between government, between civil society, between non-government organisations, and really look at what we can do when it comes to curriculum development to teach the necessary life skills and also the necessary employability skills. So one of the things that's being done now in terms of research is looking at what are the 21st century skills that youth should have to enable them to function effectively in their particular society, which is changing rapidly. Whether it's a developing country or developed country, this aspect of change, often rapid change, is simply part of the fabric now. So this partnership is very, very important, and making sure that the various partners are listened to and that the outcomes are ones which are going to satisfy the various interest groups.
Mm-hmm. I did want to talk a little bit about the rise of the green economy and sustainable development and how this is impacting economic growth and the job market. I'm wondering, if you could talk about that a little bit in terms of your perspective of what's happening in regions across the world.
Well, there is an increasing concern, isn't there, with the environment and
Mm-hmm.
with global warming and with maintaining the natural environment in ways that don't undermine the sort of quality of life in individuals. So I've been involved with a big research project in the Asia Pacific region with the Asian Development Bank, and that's
Right.
looking at green growth. I mean, it's said that the Asia Pacific region will be the region of the 21st century. We've got countries like China, which are rapidly moving ahead in terms of further economic development. India, we have such a range of countries within our region. Now, how can these countries develop without having economic growth and so on? But they're burning fossil fuels. They're doing things which also contribute to a worsening of the environmental situation, pollution and things like that. So this
Mm-hmm.
research has been looking at these countries and looking at how can we have growth which is green growth, where we try and minimize the adverse impact on the environment. So as we develop and we have this greater concern, increasing concern about climate change and things of that type, there are industries emerging which try to assist overcoming some of these problems. Like we have alternative energy, alternative power sources and things like that, solar, for example. So we have occupations occurring that are green occupations, right? They're very concerned with those sort of issues. But there's a feeling that all occupations should become green or greener than they currently are, that we should look at all occupations and try and minimize the adverse effect they have upon the environment. So we're talking about green jobs, both new jobs, emerging jobs, but also the greening of existing work, existing jobs. So this is a very important aspect of the curriculum reform that's occurring in many countries. And looking at curriculum reform, we have to look at the viewpoint of industry and government and other interest groups to see what needs to be done to green economies. And the second issue at the same time is making sure that growth is inclusive, that all sections of the community develop benefits out of it. So the Asian Development Bank that I've been working with on this research, and we've published some books and so on about it, is looking at how do we have economic growth in the Asia Pacific region, which is inclusive growth, benefits all sections of the community, and also green growth, minimizes the adverse effect on the environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You just heard from Dr. Rupert Maclean, an internationally renowned researcher, author, and consultant on technical and vocational education and training. This episode was brought to you by Springer Nature. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about how to increase equitable access to education and how this can help balance the scales of economic opportunity.
One of the ways in which we can actually try and achieve more equitable growth and development, where there's greater justice and fairness and things of that type, is by having high quality education systems where we give access to all sections within the community. Because, currently in many countries, women and girls don't have the same access as boys and men. Those living in rural areas don't have the same access as those living in urban areas. Some racial groups, ethnic groups have much better access than other ethnic and racial groups. So we have to look at what we can do to have education and schooling that is of benefit to all sections of the community, give everyone a chance to develop their talents to the full and to also gain from the economic development potential of their particular country. So education and schooling are seen as the key.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. And if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.